Strength in Sparta was measured not by how loud a warrior roared, but by how long he could endure in silence. Imagine a boy, no older than 12, bound at the altar of Artemis Orthia. The lash tears his back open, blood dripping onto the stone while the crowd cheers. He does not scream. He does not beg. He stands until he collapses, sometimes dead, and still his silence is remembered as victory. Plutarch, in his Life of Lycurgus, records these ritual floggings as central to Spartan life. They were called the diamastigosis, where boys were whipped before the gods until they proved their worth. For Sparta, the lesson was clear. Pain was not an enemy but a tool. To endure it without sound was to show the highest form of discipline. To fail, to cry out, was to betray the community. This is where the paradox begins. Sparta glorified strength, but true strength was never about muscle or the spear. It was about obedience, the ability to silence the body's natural instincts and replace them with loyalty to the state. Modern psychology calls this fear conditioning, the process of rewiring the brain so that pain no longer triggers resistance, but acceptance. What should inspire rebellion instead created submission. The brilliance and horror of this system was that it disguised control as honor. To die beneath the whip without a sound was seen not as cruelty, but as courage. Yet beneath the ritual lay a darker truth. These boys were being broken not only in body, but in mind. They learned that survival itself meant surrendering their will. This contradiction, strength through silence, freedom through obedience, is what made Sparta both feared and admired. Outsiders saw warriors who never flinched. Few recognized the psychological machinery behind them, children molded through rituals that blurred the line between valor and trauma. And so the Spartan paradox emerges, a society that celebrated power by demanding submission, that praised bravery by enforcing silence, that created warriors by first teaching them to suffer. But these punishments were not cruelty for its own sake. They were rehearsals in obedience. At the age when most children still cling to their mothers, Spartan boys were torn away from them. At 7 years old, they entered the agoge, the state-run machine that would strip away comfort, individuality, and innocence, replacing them with discipline, hunger, and fear. Childhood in Sparta did not belong to the family. It belonged to the state. Xenophon, in his Constitution of the Lacedaemonians, describes this system with cold precision. Boys were divided into units, supervised by older youths and subjected to constant drills. They were given a single cloak for the entire year, forced to sleep on raids, and rationed so little food that stealing became necessary for survival. But if they were caught, the punishment was severe, not for the theft itself, but for failing to do it without detection. The lesson was clear: necessity excused transgression, but weakness in execution did not. The design of the agoge was psychological as much as physical. By denying comfort, it created dependency on the state. By enforcing hunger, it taught cunning. By humiliating boys in front of peers, it destroyed the ego that resisted conformity. Modern psychology recognizes this as early conditioning. When the brain is still malleable, repeated exposure to fear and deprivation rewires its responses. Pain becomes normal. Hunger becomes training. Obedience becomes survival. The brilliance of the system lay in its contrasts. In most cultures, childhood was a time of nurture and play. In Sparta, it was a rehearsal for death. A boy learned that his voice was not his own, that his body was a tool to be hardened, that every act was watched. The constant surveillance mirrored what Mitchell Foucault would later call the panopticon effect, the feeling of being observed until self-control is internalized. The Spartans had discovered this long before prisons and factories. They built it into their children. And yet, there was awe in this horror. Foreigners marveled at the discipline of Spartan youth, their ability to endure where others faltered. The agoge produced warriors who could march barefoot across frozen ground, who could withstand cold and hunger without complaint, who seemed unbreakable. But the cost of that strength was silence, not just of the mouth, but of the self. Psychologists call it fear suppression, the process of training the mind not to react to danger in instinctive ways. Instead of crying out, the Spartan boy learned to lock fear behind a mask of composure. Instead of resisting pain, he absorbed it, folding it into identity. But suppressing fear does not erase it. It buries it deeper where it festers, shaping every decision. This is the paradox of the agoge. It built warriors who were fearless in battle yet haunted in spirit. Their strength came not from freedom, but from the destruction of freedom. Their courage was not natural but manufactured, forged in a system that turned childhood into ritualized suffering. And so, the Spartan boy learned his first and most enduring lesson, that survival meant mastering not just the spear, but the self. To live in Sparta was to fight a war long before one ever faced an enemy. Yet the most terrifying lesson wasn't how to fight enemies, it was how to fight yourself. In most cultures, strength is measured by how long you can fight before you fall. In Sparta, it was measured by how long you could suffer without making a sound. To the Spartans, endurance was not about survival, it was about silence. Pain was not an obstacle but a proving ground, and to flinch was to fail. Among the most infamous rituals was the endurance contest held at the altar of Artemis Orthia. Boys were whipped relentlessly, sometimes until their flesh hung in strips, while families and citizens looked on. The goal was not to escape, not even to survive, but to remain silent as long as possible. Victory went to the boy who could suffer longest without breaking. Death under the lash was not disgrace, it was glory. To endure beyond sanity was the highest form of strength. Plutarch recounts how mothers would not mourn sons who died in these contests. Instead, they celebrated them, declaring that their silence honored Sparta. To cry out was shame. To bleed quietly was triumph. These rituals were not sideshows, they were central to Spartan identity. Endurance was a civic virtue, rehearsed in blood. Modern psychology gives us tools to understand this sinister logic. One is terror management theory, which explains how cultures use rituals to cope with the inevitability of death. By framing pain and mortality as honorable, Sparta turned its youth into symbols of the state's immortality. The boy who died silently at the altar was not simply lost. He became proof that Spartan discipline could outlast flesh itself. Another principle at work was desensitization. Repeated exposure to violence dulls natural responses. By watching boys die under the whip, Spartans normalized suffering, teaching the community to see endurance as ordinary, even noble. What should have been horror became spectacle, and what should have been compassion became contempt for weakness. Here lies the strength vs. sanity dynamic. To cultivate one, Sparta sacrificed the other. Endurance at this level demanded the suppression of instinct to cry out, to recoil, to fight back. But instincts exist for survival, and to erase them is to fracture the mind. The silence Sparta admired was not resilience alone, it was dissociation, a mind forced to detach from the body to endure the unbearable. The audience, too, was conditioned. Parents, friends, and peers became complicit, their pride blinding them to cruelty. Applause reinforced the lesson, strength meant suffering, and sanity was expendable. The boy at the altar was not just tested for himself, he was teaching everyone watching what Sparta demanded. And so endurance became a cult. It was not enough to fight bravely in war, one had to suffer bravely at home. It was not enough to kill enemies, one had to kill instincts. The ritual of silence reshaped the Spartan identity from childhood onward, creating warriors who were feared not just for their strength, but for their unnatural composure under agony. This was Sparta's greatest achievement and its greatest horror, a society that forged invincible bodies by breaking fragile minds. Their victories on the battlefield were born in the shrines of Artemis, where endurance meant silencing the very cry of the human soul. Because in Sparta, the body was not the true battlefield, the mind was. Strength in Sparta was not measured only in how one fought on the battlefield, but in what one was willing to do in the shadows. Among the most disturbing rites of passage was the crypteia, a secret institution that turned boys into predators and their fellow humans into prey. Plutarch describes it plainly. Selected youths were sent out at night, armed only with daggers, to roam the countryside and kill helots, the enslaved population who worked Spartan fields. These killings were not random violence. They were state-sanctioned terror, designed to remind the helots of their subjugation and to bind young Spartans into loyalty through blood. Courage in Sparta was not only tested against enemies abroad, it was proven by spilling the blood of the powerless at home. The crypteia was as much psychological as it was physical. To stalk men in the dark, to kill them while they slept, demanded a suppression of conscience. By forcing their youth into this role, Sparta reshaped morality itself. Murder was reframed as duty, cruelty as necessity. This is what modern psychologists identify as moral disengagement, the process by which individuals silence empathy and justify violence under the banner of obedience. Once a young man crossed that threshold, returning to ordinary morality became impossible. And yet, here lies the contradiction. Sparta glorified courage, but the crypteia was not courage in the traditional sense. It was not the clash of equals on a battlefield, but the killing of the defenseless in shadows. This was not honor, it was indoctrination. By eroding the line between valor and atrocity, Sparta ensured its warriors were not merely strong, they were controlled. The helots, too, were caught in the cycle. Every harvest season, Sparta declared ritual war on them, giving the state legal cover to sanction their slaughter. The message was unmistakable. Fear was permanent, freedom impossible. The system thrived not just on Spartan dominance but on helot terror, a psychological grip more binding than chains. For the young Spartans, the crypteia was the final test, not of how hard they could strike, but of how far they could suppress their humanity. The transformation was irreversible. Once they had murdered at the state's command, loyalty was no longer a choice but a bond sealed in blood. This is why the crypteia remains one of the most haunting practices in history. It shows how power can twist ideals, how courage can be corrupted into cruelty, and how loyalty can be manufactured through fear. It was not strength that Sparta demanded, it was submission to fear itself. To be loyal to Sparta was to live inside a paradox. A citizen was told he was free, yet that freedom rested on the endless slavery of others. He was praised for self-control, yet commanded to commit acts of sanctioned violence. He was taught to value courage, yet ordered to kill the defenseless in silence. To remain loyal, a Spartan had to embrace contradictions so severe that sanity itself bent beneath the weight of obedience. Thucydides offers a telling contrast. In his History of the Peloponnesian War, he notes how Spartans were slow to act, hesitant in open battle, cautious to the point of paralysis. Yet at home, they unleashed relentless brutality upon the helots, massacring them whenever unrest threatened. The warrior celebrated abroad as disciplined and deliberate was, at home, an executioner of slaves. This contradiction was not an accident. It was the foundation of Spartan identity. Modern psychology helps us make sense of this. Leon Festinger's theory of cognitive dissonance explains how people resolve the discomfort of holding contradictory beliefs by reshaping their perception of reality. Spartans were trapped in exactly this bind. How could they claim to be the bravest of men while murdering unarmed peasants? By redefining murder as loyalty. How could they claim liberty while enslaving entire populations? By convincing themselves that liberty meant the right to dominate. The contradictions did not break the system. They held it together. This dynamic was reinforced through group conformity. The famous Ash experiments showed how individuals will deny their own senses to align with the majority. In Sparta, this was magnified 100-fold. From the agoge onward, boys learned that dissent was not simply disobedience but betrayal of the state. To question was to isolate oneself, and isolation in Sparta was worse than death. Obedience became identity. Even more chilling are the parallels to Stanley Milgram's obedience studies, where participants administered what they believed were lethal shocks simply because authority instructed them to. The Spartans had engineered this principle into daily life centuries earlier. Orders to kill, to remain silent, to endure cruelty. These were not choices but obligations, and once a young Spartan obeyed, he was trapped. Each act of submission chained him tighter to the system, until loyalty was indistinguishable from madness. The result was a society where contradiction became a weapon. Publicly, Spartans praised discipline and restraint, even as they indulged in secret rites of terror. They mocked the luxuries of Athens while presiding over communal feasts that enforced uniformity. They claimed valor in war yet relied on deception, endurance, and intimidation more than battlefield brilliance. Loyalty required not reconciling these contradictions, but surrendering to them. This surrender bred a quiet menace. A Spartan could smile at his comrades, march in formation, and feast in silence, all while knowing that his loyalty had been proven in blood. Each man carried secrets that bound him to the collective. And those who doubted, who felt the pull of conscience, quickly discovered there was no place for doubt in a world that demanded total submission. Here is where madness entered. Loyalty demanded a man split himself in two, the human who might recoil at cruelty, and the Spartan who could not afford to. To remain sane in Sparta was to accept insanity as normal. Fear became virtue, obedience became freedom, cruelty became justice. And yet, this distortion was precisely what made Sparta formidable. Its citizens could act with unwavering discipline not because they were free of contradiction, but because they had learned to live inside it. Their minds, bent by loyalty, no longer resisted the impossible, they embraced it. This is the sinister truth of Spartan power. Loyalty was not forged in honor, but in contradiction. To be truly Spartan was to silence reason itself in the name of obedience. And at the heart of this contradiction lay the most disturbing test of all. In most societies, the dining table is a place of warmth, laughter, stories, the breaking of bread as a bond of trust. In Sparta, the table was something else entirely. It was the syssitia, the communal mess where every citizen ate the same food under the same rules in silence. Fellowship was demanded, but it was fellowship under surveillance. Xenophon, in his Constitution of the Lacedaemonians, describes these meals as law-bound, not voluntary. Attendance was compulsory, the food intentionally simple: barley bread, black broth, a bit of meat. Luxury was forbidden. The message was unmistakable here: you are not an individual but a part of the machine. You did not feast, you endured. You did not choose, you obeyed. The psychology of the syssitia was as deliberate as the rituals of the training ground. By stripping food of pleasure, Sparta turned nourishment into discipline. By enforcing uniformity, it erased personal identity. Even eating became a rehearsal in conformity. Modern psychologists might call this normative social influence, the pressure to align with group behavior to avoid rejection. At the Spartan table, conformity wasn't subtle. It was survival. What looked like camaraderie was, in truth, a test. A man who spoke too much, who ate too eagerly, who failed to sit properly could be shamed or expelled. And expulsion was no small thing. To be excluded from the syssisha was to be excluded from the very definition of citizenship. Without the table, a Spartan was not truly Spartan. The bowl of broth in front of him was not food, it was belonging. This contrast, fellowship vs. surveillance, defined the atmosphere. On the surface, men shared meals as equals. In reality, each meal reminded them of their chains. The taste of the broth was secondary to the watchful eyes measuring every gesture. Each spoonful carried a warning: you are being judged, not nourished. Even here, silence was weaponized. Conversation was limited, discipline enforced through quiet. A meal that might have been joyous elsewhere became a ritual of restraint, an echo of the larger Spartan paradox: strength through suppression, unity through fear. The Sissisher reveals Sparta's deepest insight into control. Domination does not require constant violence. Sometimes it requires repetition, the slow erosion of individuality through everyday acts. Bread and broth became tools of submission. By turning something as natural as eating into a performance of loyalty, Sparta proved that obedience could be carved into every corner of life. Because for Sparta, even bread and broth could become weapons of control. There was one ordeal that revealed the core of Sparta's darkness, a test where strength was no longer measured by victory in combat, but by the ability to endure pain until the mind itself began to fracture. To the Spartans, true worth lay in silence, even when flesh was torn, even when sanity wavered. This was not training for war. This was training to annihilate the self. Plutarch recounts the infamous ritual of boys who were encouraged to steal food to survive, punished not for the theft itself but for being caught. The whip came down on their backs, merciless, while they were expected to endure without a cry. One boy, Plutarch tells us, concealed a stolen fox cub beneath his cloak. Rather than confess, he allowed it to claw through his stomach, dying silently in front of his peers. For the Spartans, this was not tragedy. It was triumph. At the heart of this ritual was the expectation that endurance proved more than physical toughness. It proved a willingness to suppress instinct, to mute fear, to deny hunger, to silence agony. To falter outwardly was weakness. To die inwardly was glory. And so, flogging, starvation, and forced silence converged into one twisted test of strength versus sanity. Modern psychology gives us the language to understand what was happening. This was dissociation, the mind's ability to separate from unbearable pain by detaching from reality. The boy at the altar, the youth whipped for stealing, learned not to resist but to retreat inward, to fracture his own consciousness in order to survive the unbearable. Outwardly, he appeared composed. Inwardly, his mind was being broken into pieces. Another principle at work was trauma bonding. By tying survival to obedience, Sparta created a system where victims became attached to their oppressors. The boys learned to equate approval with endurance, loyalty with silence, belonging with suffering. Each lash of the whip became both punishment and reward, a reminder that pain was the price of being truly Spartan. Once bonded through trauma, there was no escape. The boy would grow into a man incapable of separating loyalty from self-destruction. The brilliance and the horror of this test was how it blurred the line between strength and insanity. A Spartan could starve, be whipped, watch his peers die beside him, and still maintain composure. Outsiders marveled at this discipline, seeing it as the pinnacle of courage. Yet beneath the mask lay minds taught to split apart, bodies sacrificed on the altar of obedience. This is where the paradox reaches its peak. Sparta claimed to build warriors of unmatched resilience, but it did so by demanding silence in the face of suffering so profound that it corroded the very essence of humanity. The test of strength was, in truth, a test of how far the mind could bend before it broke. The tragic unraveling of these boys was not incidental, it was institutional. They were trained to believe that the suppression of their cries, the denial of their hunger, the fracture of their sanity was the highest form of honor, and so they marched into adulthood not as free men, but as hollow vessels molded for the state's purposes. And in pushing men beyond pain, Sparta discovered the cost of breaking the mind. Sparta built itself on discipline so rigid that it appeared unbreakable. Yet in the long run, that very rigidity became its greatest weakness. The system that forged warriors also bred paranoia, obsession with control, and an inability to adapt to a world beyond its walls. Discipline, once their greatest weapon, turned into a kind of madness. The Helots were central to this fear. Outnumbering the Spartans many times over, they were kept in submission through terror and ritualized violence. But the very need for constant suppression meant Sparta lived in a permanent state of anxiety. Every harvest season brought new massacres. Every whisper of revolt demanded another round of bloodshed. Loyalty at home came not from trust, but from fear, and fear corrodes those who wield it as much as those who endure it. The same inflexibility that created legendary warriors crippled Sparta when confronted with change. In battle, their phalanx was nearly unstoppable on open ground, but they relied on discipline rather than innovation. Thucydides himself noted their cautious nature, their tendency to delay. Against smaller, more flexible forces, that discipline turned into vulnerability. At Leuctra in 371 BCE, Theban general Epaminondas shattered the Spartan phalanx with a bold, unorthodox maneuver. The Spartans, unprepared to adapt, suffered a defeat that ended their dominance forever. Psychologically, this decline was inevitable. Modern research on rigid control systems shows that over-reliance on conformity stifles resilience. When people are trained only to obey, they fail when confronted with unexpected situations. Sparta's citizens, molded to endure pain and follow commands, lacked the creativity and flexibility that survival beyond their closed society demanded. What made them terrifying in ritual contests and predictable wars made them brittle in the chaos of a changing world. The irony was stark. The city that had engineered obedience so perfectly could not engineer adaptability. Their obsession with preserving order, from the communal meals to the silent endurance tests, blinded them to the fact that survival sometimes requires breaking rules, not keeping them. In the end, the very system that ensured their unity ensured their downfall. And so Sparta declined, not with a dramatic collapse, but with a slow suffocation under the weight of its own rigidity. Their victories lived on in memory, their warriors immortalized in legend. But behind the legend was a society unable to bend, and therefore destined to break. But Sparta's obsession with strength exposed a weakness it could never escape. Sparta may have fallen, but its shadow lingered. Long after its power was broken, other civilizations looked back at Sparta not with disgust, but with admiration. Rome, in particular, was fascinated. Writers like Plutarch and later admirers praised the Spartan system as the pinnacle of discipline, austerity, and martial virtue. For a society that also glorified military strength, Sparta became a model, proof that discipline could forge a nation of warriors. But this admiration came with blindness. Roman commentators exalted the silent endurance of Spartan boys under the lash, while ignoring the cost of such rituals. They praised communal meals and simplicity of life, while overlooking the helots, the enslaved population whose constant oppression made the Spartan system possible. Rome idealized the image of men hardened by pain, but erased the psychological scars and moral corruption such a system demanded. This selective memory reveals a timeless truth about power. Societies often celebrate the spectacle of discipline while ignoring the suffering that sustains it. Sparta became less a city-state than a myth, a symbol wielded to inspire soldiers and justify austerity. The horror of state-sanctioned terror, the paranoia of constant suppression, the madness of contradictions, all of it was buried beneath the legend of warriors who never surrendered. And yet, there were always whispers of unease. Foreign travelers marveled at Spartan toughness but recoiled at its methods. To outsiders who valued freedom of thought, the silence of Spartan conformity seemed less like strength and more like suffocation. The admiration and revulsion existed side by side, proof that Sparta was both an ideal and a warning. What remains unsettling is how often history repeats this pattern. The world is quick to admire strength, discipline, and endurance while forgetting the hidden cost of such systems. We celebrate the surface while ignoring the shadows beneath it. And yet, the deeper truth of Sparta still lingers in our world today. The story of Sparta does not end with the fall of its armies. Its legacy lives on, not only in the admiration of later civilizations, but in the darker lessons it left behind. What Sparta perfected was not merely the art of war, but the art of control, a system that weaponized suffering into obedience. Their strength vs. sanity test was more than ritual. It was a blueprint, one that authoritarian systems, armies, and institutions would echo for centuries. Modern scholars like Paul Cartledge have argued that the myth of Sparta hides more cruelty than glory. Behind the polished image of fearless warriors lay a society built on oppression, conformity, and psychological fracture. Yet this myth, the idea that pain produces virtue, that silence equals discipline, has proven difficult to erase. It lingers because it flatters power. It promises rulers that loyalty can be engineered, that obedience can be carved into flesh. The echoes are unmistakable. Military training around the world still borrows from Spartan methods: deprivation, humiliation, ritual endurance. Recruits are broken down, their individuality stripped, before being rebuilt as part of a collective. While modern armies justify this as forging resilience, the psychology is the same: suffering reframed as strength, silence reframed as loyalty. The pattern appears beyond the battlefield. Hazing rituals in schools, fraternities, and secret societies replicate the Spartan paradox on a smaller scale. Those who endure humiliation and pain become bonded to the group, convinced that survival proves worth. What should repel instead creates belonging, a textbook example of trauma bonding. Like Sparta, these systems thrive on the lie that cruelty is the price of honor. Authoritarian regimes, too, have drawn from the Spartan script. Public displays of endurance, suppression of individuality, rituals that fuse identity with obedience, all function as modern-day agoge. Whether in mass rallies or prisons, the goal is the same: to break down the self until loyalty feels natural, even inevitable. But there is also a lesson here, one that empowers rather than terrifies. Understanding the mechanics of manipulation is the first defense against it. Fear conditioning, cognitive dissonance, trauma bonding, these are not abstract terms but the very tools used to shape human behavior. Sparta shows us how they can be wielded to create warriors who seem unbreakable, but who are in fact deeply bound by invisible chains. The myth of Sparta is seductive. It tells us that endurance is noble, that silence is strength, that obedience is virtue. But history reveals the cost. A society that conquered bodies but fractured minds, that won glory on the battlefield but could not escape its own paranoia and rigidity. And so, the warning remains. Strength born of suffering may look unshakable, but it is always fragile. The greatest danger is not the lash on the back or the hunger in the stomach. It is the surrender of thought, the silencing of the self. Sparta proved that the greatest danger is not losing the body, but surrendering the mind.